You should start getting used to the basement. That was the first thing she said. No preface, no condolence. Like she was offering a practical fact about the house the way I'd once offered a beam's load capacity to a worried contractor. The words landed like a weight I already knew how to measure. Displacement. Redistributed stress. Only this time the structure was my life. Kellen had been gone 3 days. I had stood through the rites, handed away to the ground the one man who'd been stubborn enough to argue with me over a rivet and tender enough to tell me where I was wrong, and come back to a house that wore grief like a draft. All rooms hollowed out, echoes in the corners. I expected some rearrangement. I did not expect a cardboard barricade across the front steps. My wife's china shattered in a pattern like a starburst on the porch. A pile of my tools and photographs stacked beside the mailbox as if they had been refuse sorted for pickup. Bryn Ashford stood on the porch with a clipboard and the kind of calm that is practiced in laboratories and boardrooms. Milo hovered behind her, a foreman by trade and a threat by temperament, broad-shouldered, impatient with anything that smelled like memory. Bryn's voice was thin and specific. "We're consolidating things," she told me. "It'll be easier for everyone if you keep to the lower level for now. There are arrangements to be made." "Arrangements," I said, and looked at the china. The pieces were my wife's, Margaret's before her, and Kellen had wanted them kept safe. They lay in shards as if someone had rehearsed their falling. She looked at me like I was a tool left in the wrong place. "We need room for the memorial visitors next week," she said. "It's not practical to have you upstairs. You can keep things in the basement. You'll have the shower, basic provisions. We'll see about the house in due time." It was the way she said "we" that cut. When I was an inspector, "we" meant load, ledger, team. When Bryn said it, she meant property, our threshold shifting under her calculation. Milo nudged me with a shoulder that would have made a junior foreman wince. He didn't hit. He didn't need to. The shove was a geometry lesson. Force applied to an elderly body moves a family the way wind moves a pennant. I stepped down the stairs like someone inspecting a crack, eyes measuring the support I no longer had. There are things that make you feel smaller than your age, smaller than your bones. The pile of boxes on the porch with my name written in an unfamiliar hand was one. The neighbor, Margaret Holloway, watched from her hedge with the look of someone who keeps her curtains open to history. She walked over and stood close enough that I could have taken her hand, but we both knew grief wants to be folded up by itself. Instead, she fixed me with a look that said silently, "Call Garrett." I did, clutching the receiver like a lifeline. Garrett is my brother by blood and by trade. He retired 10 years ago from the Detroit force with a shoulder full of memories and a head full of method. People who become detectives can never stop looking for the wrong pieces. That habit runs in our family the way a blueprint runs on a drafting table. It's what you look at when everything looks like ruin. I was at the funeral, I told him. Came back to find myself on the porch. "I'll be over," he said. "Don't touch anything." He arrived faster than I expected, an old gray coat moving with the same careful economy he once used to thread a needle. Garrett's eyes travel like a beam of an inspection lamp. They find what's not lining up. He circled the house, made a careful pass inside, and said, "They moved things. That's not the same arrangement. They cleared out drawers. Someone took the safe and the paperwork." "Which safe?" I asked. There were two, one under the basement stairs, one in Kellen's office behind a false panel we had built when he was a boy and hid his first mechanical drawings there. "The one behind the false panel," he said. "Someone pried it." My hands remembered the key, the hum of metal on metal. Kellen had a way of hiding his valuables like a man who knew how to leave a structure redundant, multiple points of protection. He'd said once, half a joke, half a parishioner's prayer, that you never know which valve will save you. Now the valve was gone. In the basement the light was weak, a single bulb swinging. It smelled faintly of bleach and cold pipes. Bryn had left a bag of cereal and a thermos near the cot, and a little radio that was tuned to a station that played songs the dead used to like. They had been careful in the way of people making an eviction appear compassionate. They had left my toothbrush. They had taken my voice. I began to inventory. I checked the workbench. A spot where I'd welded a replacement clamp was missing a socket. Photographs from my parents' wedding were gone. The box of my wife's letters that Kellen had insisted we keep in the house, gone. In their place, a thin envelope with my signature forged on a document that named Bryn as a power of attorney. I sat down on the concrete and the word forged landed with the solidity of a dropped nut. It was a legal instrument with my name, my handwriting imitated by a hand that had thought ahead. The paper was recent. The executor clauses had been adjusted. It was a theft dressed as bureaucracy. Garrett read the document like a man reading a fracture line. "This isn't just eviction," he said. "This is appropriation. Someone wanted control before the grief settled." "You think she had my signature?" My voice shook, not with tears, but with the slow kind of fury that is colder and more precise. "She never asked." "Someone did it who had access," he said. "Someone who could get into your desk, get into Kellen's files." We sat there listening to the house settle. The basement felt like an underdeck, cool, protected, less visible. For an inspector, every support has a story. Each beam bears a record. I have a habit of listening to wood the way most men listen for forgiveness. The house told me, in the tick of a pipe and the whisper of a draft, that someone had been here premeditatedly. The safe was not simply taken. It had been opened and emptied. "I want you to look at the vents," Garrett said, practical as a beam. He moved toward the laundry shelf and found the duct covers glossier, a soft sheen consistent with newer patching. "Someone sealed vents. See? That tape. That wasn't there yesterday." He pulled a strip free with a tenderness that felt almost sacramental. Under the tape, the seam showed signs of tampering. I have always believed that a house keeps secrets in its joints. This one had been neat about hers. The first night, sleep found me for an hour, then left. I would wake with the image of Kellen the way he had been. Stubborn laugh, grease under his fingernails from a late-night project. A mind that thought of contingencies the way other men thought of weather. He liked to say, "You don't leave a bridge to chance," and he meant it. He applied that same stubbornness to life plans and to family. He had set things in place that we called eccentric. Encrypted drives hidden in cordless phones, passwords disguised as birthdays, cameras tucked into mantelpieces. I had laughed once, told him he was a paranoid engineer. He had smiled and told me, "Paranoia is the other name for foresight when it keeps people you love alive." The second morning, Quinn came up the stairs. She was in a dress Kellen used to hate, and a look on her face half wide with the leftover candor of 9.5 a wariness no child should ever be packing. She stood in the doorway and watched me like someone appraising an unfamiliar beam in a familiar bridge. "Daddy?" she asked, then corrected, "Granddad." I wanted to catch her and fold her small weight into my arms like a handset placed back into its cradle, but Bryn's earlier words were still in me. "You have to tell me what you remember," I said. "Only what you want to tell." She told me in staccato, the kind children use when they condense sorrow to fit into their small mouths. "Mom put blue stuff in Daddy's water," she said. "She said it would help him with the shakes. Then Daddy slumped. She told me to tell people Daddy had diabetes. She said it was easier." My bones listened to the grammar of the story. Blue stuff. The smell Kellen hadn't had in life. The way the room smelled of cleaners and kitchen oil. I did not translate her words into the names of chemicals. I translated them into pattern, medication given by someone with access, explanation supplied, refusal of medical escalation until it was too late. A consistent architecture of deception. "Did you ever see Mom give you anything?" I asked. "Did she ever want you to taste it?" Quinn looked at me like I had asked whether the bridge was safe. "She made me taste a spoonful once," she said. "She told me it tasted like syrup. She said it would help reduce the fever. I didn't like it. It burned a little." I swallowed that and tasted the slang of guilt in my mouth. Children use the word syrup for comfort. The same word can be used to hide a poison. I didn't let my mind's eye sketch the how. My training stops at detection. It refuses construction. I only saw outcomes. Death, forgery, occupancy changed, and the lines between them. Garrett found a small device behind the smoke detector in the hall. A lens like a pinhole camera, and a stash of micro SD cards taped behind the housing. He turned it over in his palm and lit the night with a look that said the world had provided a ledger. "Whoever put this here knew they would need to prove things or obscure them," he said. "It records. It stores. If Kellen thought ahead, it might connect to a cloud." A cloud is an invisible ledger. Kellen, as all engineers, liked redundancy. He liked knowing that if a physical copy went missing, a digital echo remained. But a cloud is only as useful as the key that unlocks it. Whoever held the key had access. Whoever knew the patterns could silence the file. "You sure it's not just a baby monitor?" I asked. "Kids have those." He shrugged. "It is a baby monitor until it isn't. This is a camera with storage." We brought the device down to the workbench under better light. The SD cards were labeled in a hand that found cursive when writing names and codes when hiding secrets. Kellen used codes the way other men used middle initials. He would encrypt a passcode into something innocuous. I remember the rote numbers he liked to joke about, dates that only family would get. Quinn's birthday, a string of numbers, 5 digits, carved into her stuffed rabbit sometime when she was younger. 051505, he had said once, as if sharing a bookmark. The number had always sounded like a small map, a private coordinate between father and daughter. I didn't say the numbers aloud. Memory can be an exposed wire, but the idea of that date lodged in my chest like a splinter. "You remember his little tricks," Garrett said, reading me like I was a ledger. "He set protections. He double-locked things. If the cloud exists, the key is probably something Quinn would know." Quinn sat on the foot of the cot and listened, a small person smelling the wind before a storm. She had not been made to unfold details. She had seen a part and had been told to be silent about the architecture of pain. Children learn how to be complicit quickly when their caretakers teach them obedience in place of love. My phone buzzed. It was an unlisted number. The display read, Jonathan Reeves. He was the name Kellen had carved into the margins of his will, a family attorney who had been efficient enough for our needs and quiet enough for our tragedies. I answered, hands steady because the voice on the other end sounded like law. "Mr. Vance?" he said. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I said, and then omitted the rest. "Grief is a ledger you don't need to file twice." "I've been following the filings," he said. "There's odd activity. Transfers to an offshore account with a beneficiary that matches a name associated with your daughter-in-law's relatives. Also, a power of attorney with your signature filed earlier this week." "I have a document here," I said. I told him to meet us at the house. "Bring whatever proof you have." Within the hour, he was there, neat suit, calm hands, a man who had made a career of translating human choices into legal grammar. He looked at the forged document like a paragraph misplaced in a technical manual. "Forgery does 2 things," he said. "It gives custody and it tries to quiet inquiry. If Bryn had this, she could transfer assets, take control of medical decisions and—" He stopped, and the sentence didn't need finishing. I thought of Kellen's ledger. Engineers like to leave guides. They leave records because they can't be sure others will read them. Kellen had been meticulous in ways that should have been a doctrine. He had made me a list once of what to do if anything happened to him. The list was in his handwriting, folded into a pocket of a coat he always got oil on. I had never looked. I climbed the basement stairs and felt them creak under the new load of my body. On the porch, the smashed china still lay like a memory arrhythmia. Bryn met us at the top of the steps and smiled in a way that wanted to be both conciliatory and in control. I did not let myself answer her smile. The chords of it were taut with calculation. "We're just reorganizing," she said, as if restructuring a ledger. "I have to protect Quinn. There are people who will try to take advantage. I offered to arrange temporary guardianship until things settled." "Temporary guardianship," I said. The echo came out wrong. I wasn't asked. "You were getting in the way," she said. Garrett didn't argue with her. He watched. He had the patience of a man who knew the court is a different kind of scaffold. "Stay out of the basement," he said to Bryn in his measured way, "and don't touch anything until we've inventoried." Bryn bristled and then turned away, conscious of an audience she hadn't invited. Milo stepped in like a brace, a hand on her elbow. Both of them retreating to the living room where the television had been set to a muted channel like it could mask conversation. That night, I went through Kellen's office. He had left a desktop there, but the hard drive had been missing. In its place, tucked into a false bottom drawer, a note with a cipher written in his messy shorthand. The ledger said something like Quinn 051505 Cloud, terse as a blueprint note. I held the paper to the light like a man reading a hairline fracture. The number on the note matched the birthday I had not said aloud. I turned the house into a place of questions. The questions are like stakes. If you hammer them in, something will hold. Quinn crept to me at dusk and asked if I would tell her a story. I told her about the first bridge I'd inspected when I was a boy, about the way a hairline fracture can become a canyon if ignored. She listened like a small engineer, then asked me, matter of fact, "Will someone go to jail if they hurt Daddy?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." It was a promise that felt both inadequate and whole. Grief teaches you the difference between the two. Garrett and I spent the next morning documenting everything. He took photos with a camera that clicks like a metronome, capturing angles, threads, fingerprints of neglect. Neighborhood gossip is a poor substitute for evidence, but often reveals patterns. Margaret brought over a thermos and a cigarette in her short, brisk way and told us she had seen Milo hauling boxes to his truck the morning after the funeral. She had also seen Bryn burn a stack of papers on the back stoop the week before, a detail that smelled of intention. I found my late wife's locket in one of Bryn's boxes, tarnished, thumb-printed, placed under a shirt that smelled like the detergent in which she had packed it. I could have demanded it then and there, but Garrett held me back with one hand and gave me the other. "Later," he said, "we build a case, not a fury. We built the foundation the way you secure a bridge before repairs, one point at a time, catalogued, photographed, recorded. There is something methodical about grieving through evidence. It gives you a scaffold where emotion could otherwise buckle." Late that afternoon, when the light tilted and the house sighed in a way that felt like shifting memory, Garrett found a series of emails on a discarded phone. Messages between Bryn and a number that matched a name I'd heard whispered in new circles. Doris Hargrove, listed as Bryn's mother and resident in Florida. The emails discussed transfers, mentions of an account with international routing, and best of all a line that said, "Once the papers are done, we'll be set." "I've seen this script," Garrett said, leaning back in the kitchen chair like a man marking the bearing of a beam. "It's not just a family squabble. This was put together with help." Everything was beginning to look like a plan. I slept less. I walked the house at night with a flashlight and a list. A house is honest when you look close enough. The motion sensor in the hallway blinked a tiny red like a secret kept. And I took note. Kellen was a man who prepared for storms. He also prepared for the weakness of men. The next morning I found something else. A letter folded into a tin coffee can in the garden shed, addressed to me in Kellen's hand with smudges of engine oil. My name, Silas, across the top like an invitation. It began simply, "If anything should happen." The sentence continued with the sort of terse engineer's humility Kellen had always cultivated. He wrote about contingencies, about the cloud, about the code for Quinn's safe, and about how certain people would act when given easy access. He didn't accuse names. He provided a map. He had left instructions in case his voice was no longer in the room. He'd always been practical about death, like an inspector prescribing a schedule for maintenance. But hidden in the practical was tenderness. He had made sure Quinn had contingencies. He had willed me the right to question. When I showed the can to Garrett, his face softened into an expression I rarely saw. One of kinship, of shared both grief and duty. He tried to build a firewall, Garrett said. He tried to make sure the family couldn't be taken from within. Then why didn't it hold? I asked. Why did the safe get pried? Why was my name on a document? Garrett's answer was not an answer, but an observation. Construction doesn't fail because of one flaw. It fails because someone undermined it from the inside. We had enough at that point to make a plan. We were not cops. We were a retired inspector and a retired detective, men with a lifetime of noticing edges. We could assemble a ledger of suspicion and turn it into a warrant if necessary. I thought of calling the DA then, of reading the house into official grammar. But Jonathan told us to wait until we had both document and motion. The justice system likes its scaffolding orderly. So we kept searching. On the third day, I found a small plastic jar under the sink in Kellen's kitchen, tucked behind a stack of seldom-used pans. The lid had been scuffed. In it lay a residue that looked like dried syrup, the blue tang of kitchen chemicals. I did not identify it. I did not name it. I placed it in a raw evidence bag we'd bought from an old contacts kit and sealed it. Naming would come later with the courts. It was then that Quinn spoke up again, quietly. "Daddy left me a game," she said, on the old laptop. He said if anything happened, I should look under the clock. Garrett's gaze moved to the grandfather clock in the hall, a hulking piece Kellen had rewired to hide a small niche. Kellen liked little safety measures the way some men like crosswalks. They are small, sensible gestures against uncertainty. The clock, to the untrained eye, ticked and chimed. To us, it held a secret. We removed the panel and found a small USB drive taped to the inner face. It was the sort of thing you expect to find in tech stories, tiny, crucial, easy to overlook. On it, a file named simply 4dad.txt. We copied the file to Garrett's laptop and looked at the screen like a pair of men reading a will. The message was in Kellen's hand, typed, precise, and laced with his brand of quiet humor. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I'm either dead by natural misfortune or by the incompetence of an enemy who underestimated my obsession with backups. For the first, I'm sorry. For the second, I'm not surprised. Use the cloud key. Quinn's birthday. It's 051505. If that doesn't work, look under the smoke detector." The room shrank and then expanded. Kellen had left us a key offered in plain sight. He had left it for the people he trusted most, his father and his daughter. He had left it in a place only a child would think to look. Why would he make it that obvious? I asked out loud, though the answer was already in the sentence like a carved beam. Garrett smiled the way a man does when the world hands you a hinge, because he knew the right people are the ones who will look for their own. We weren't naive. Making something obvious makes it safe only if you know the people who are looking are the ones you trust. Bryn could claim she found it. Bryn could claim forgetfulness. Bryn could claim anything a practiced lieutenant of plausible deniability could. There was a new sound then. The house's phone, downstairs in the utility room, rang in a voice as ordinary as a mail truck. Bryn picked up in the living room and I heard her say, "Yes, they're here, but it's under control. We're handling the estate. We'll be fine." She sounded as if she had rehearsed the line in the mirror. Garrett and I looked at each other. The map was beginning to fill in with ink, forged signatures, seized items, suspicious transfers, a hidden camera, a cloud key. It was not random. Someone had planned to take advantage of a moment of sorrow and used the logistical chaos of mourning as cover. Later that evening, as rain started to thread the roof, I sat on the back steps and held Kellen's USB in my palm the way a man holds ballast. The word restoration came cheap on the lips, but we knew restoration is work like replacing a truss. You shore up the beams, replace the sliced members, teach the next generation where to look. Quinn came out with a small sapling and dirt under her nails. "We should plant this by the bridge," she said. Daddy liked bridges. We walked together to the lane that overlooks the creek and the old suspension bridge I had once inspected and loved for its simplicity. The bridge was an honest thing. Tensioned cables, predictable load, a place where a man's life can either be measured or saved. I thought of Kellen and his habit for building redundancies. I thought of the family as a structure that had been compromised from within. "Let's put it where we can see it," I told her, and we dug a small hole into hard clay and placed the sapling in the earth like someone starting a long-term repair. I promised her, and myself, that by the time the tree was big enough to shade us, we'd have made things right. We returned that night with a plan. Gather proof, secure the evidence, involve the DA when warranted. We would not thunder in like a mob. We would build a case the way an inspector builds a bridge: measure, test, verify, submit. As the rain came harder, I went back to Kellen's writings. He had not only hidden a key, he had left a pattern. A clock that held a drive, a smoke detector with a cam, a cloud with a password tied to a child's birthday. His protection was a love letter to preparedness. And yet, there was a lesion in the plan. The Pride safe, the forged document, the offshore accounts. Someone had anticipated his precautions and had built countermeasures. Whoever that someone was, they had access and the patience to stage a quiet removal. At the bottom of the list of things to do, after cataloging, after calling the DA and getting an idea of timeline, after sealing the jar and wrapping the USB in evidence tape, there was one task I didn't write, but could not ignore. To confront Bryn with the footage Kellen had left, or at least to retrieve the files from the smoke detector and the clock before someone else did. Garrett agreed and said he would make calls to an old colleague who still had warrant-writing muscle. "We don't go in guns blazing," he said. "We collect. We make it legal. We move the law to do what vigilantes can't." I nodded. If there was one thing I had learned in 70 years of reading Steel and River, it was this: bridges are repaired to carry weight, not to collapse in revenge. That night, when the house finally surrendered to sleep, I returned to the basement and pried open the false bottom of Kellen's trunk. Inside, among spare gloves and a child's jacket, lay a stack of envelopes labeled with years like anchors holding dates. The top one had a small hand-drawn map with a note in Kellen's handwriting: clock, smoke, cloud. If Bryn appears to have taken anything, check the cloud first. He had drawn a little smiley face next to Quinn. I slept for an hour after that, and in my dreams I walked a bridge with missing planks and saw the names of the people who had used grief as a blueprint for theft. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and a certainty in my gut. The next morning, full of a kind of cold resolve, Garrett and I prepared to access the smoke detector camera. We had the device, we had the USB, and we had, if Kellen's notes were right, a key that only Quinn remembered. I had a feeling that if his camera told the story Kellen suspected, Bryn would not be able to talk around the images. We talked quietly in the kitchen, our voices low as men who know evidence is an animal that must be approached with care. I had no illusions about the legal wrangling to come. Evidence must be obtained legally if it is to hold in court. We would call the DA as soon as we had something to bring. We would document every step. We would not be the jury. We moved toward the clock where, tucked in the inner face, Kellen's drive had waited. The clock's chime echoed through the hallway like an Old Testament. When I opened the little hidden niche, the USB lay there like a small, patient thing. Garrett plugged the USB into his laptop and began to copy files. My hands felt like the hands of an inspector reaching for a seam. The first file was a folder labeled Kitchen Cam. The video player opened, and in a way that felt like exposure. The screen showed a living room I knew, sunlight on the rug, the kettle on the stove, the couch where Kellen used to nap, and two figures, Bryn, young and composed, and Milo, moving in the background carrying boxes. There it was, an image of Bryn in the kitchen, a hand tilting a container toward Kellen's cup. He did not yet slump. He was talking to her in a way that suggests trust. She smiled at him with the kind of pity that can hang a noose around compassion. The camera's angle was poor for face recognition at first, but the gesture was unmistakable. There were multiple clips, some taken over months, showing small acts that had the same pattern of explanation and then withdrawal. A spoon that tasted of sweet, and then a silence that consumed the man. I felt like a man standing under a bridge and suddenly seeing the rust that had eaten a cable. The video did not make a legal case by itself without chain of custody and corroboration, but it felt like a ledger opening to the truth. And then, in the corner of the footage, a second camera's frame blinked. A handheld phone recording the kitchen scene from a different angle. In that smaller frame, a voice can be heard, muted at first but then audible. Bryn telling someone on the phone, "He's slowing down the way we expected. Keep the transfers coming." My throat tightened. The image was a key and a lock at once. Whoever was on the other end of that line had knowledge. Whoever had knowledge had motive. Garrett reached for his phone. "We need to get the DA," he said, "and we need to keep this secure." I looked at Quinn standing behind him, the way a bridge looks at water beneath it, steady, an element that can both erode and anchor. She had the innocence of someone who saw a portion of adult malfeasance and had been told to be quiet. "You did good, kiddo," I said to her. "Because what else do you say when a child tells a truth that could save a life?" She nodded and then asked plainly, "Are they bad people, Ad?" "People make bad choices," I said, "some of them criminal." She considered that like a young magistrate and then returned to her coloring book, the way children use crayons to redraw order on a chaotic page. We began to catalog the clips, make copies to secure locations, and to prepare the call. The cloud thing remained, accessible only with the code. I thought of the digits hidden in Kellen's pocket, the numbers Quinn knew like a lullaby. The cloud was the last hinge. I had a sense then of standing at a hinge point of the house, about to swing the door into motion. We had evidence enough to suspect, more to corroborate, but not yet the legal muscle to cut through the varnish of plausible deniability. The Pride safe was a smear on the blueprint, the forged POA another fracture line. Outside, a storm gathered and the bridge's cables thrummed in the wind. I thought of the way life asks simple things: hold fast, measure, and sometimes be willing to take apart what is broken and put it back stronger. We planned to go to the DA that afternoon. We planned to present the footage and the forensic sample from the jar. We planned to ask for a warrant to access the cloud, to subpoena records for the offshore transfers, to freeze accounts. We planned to do everything by book, but before we could move, a small thing tugged at the sleeve of my attention. A childlike drawing found taped to the inside of the smoke detector's housing. A scribble of a house, a figure holding a spoon, and a number beneath it. 051505. The number was the same as the one Kellen had written in his notes. It sat there like a rivet you hadn't tightened yet. I looked at Garrett. He looked back at me with a steady face. "That's our key," he said. I felt a mixture then of relief and dread. The key existed but was not yet in our hand. Accessing it would shift power. Doing so would also make everything visible to the authorities, and inevitably to Bryn. She might react. Milo might move. Doris might pull a thread from Florida that neither of us could foresee. We packed the evidence with the care of men about to bring a bridge into the light for inspection. Each item was bagged and photographed. The video files were duplicated and hashed. We did what men trained to read structures do. We made the unknown into measured things. When I dialed the DA's number, my voice sounded small in my ears, but my intent was large. "We have footage," I said. "We have a forged POA. We have potential financial transfers. We have a child witness." "Bring it in," the voice on the other end said without ceremony. "If it's good, we'll get a warrant." "One more thing," I said. "You may want to move quickly. There's a chance of asset transfers." There was a pause, and then, "We'll work on it." I hung up the phone and felt the wind shift. I know bridges well enough to know a small wind will not break the structure, but repeated gusts will loosen bolts. Timing mattered. Garrett and I were midway through the list when there came a knock at the door that was not Bryn's. Someone put a gloved hand on the brass and called, "Mr. Vance?" Margaret stood there, rain matted in her hair, a small towel in one hand. "I thought you might need this," she said. She had the kind of face that kept track of small kindnesses and filed them as currency. Behind her, on the sidewalk, a figure I didn't recognize stood a respectful distance away. A detective, by the look of him, middle-aged, practical shoes, a badge clipped to his belt. "Silas Vance?" he asked. "That's me," I said. The basement felt suddenly too small. "We got a call from the DA," he said. "They asked us to come by. There have been some alarms raised about the estate. We need to ask you a few questions." I thought of the clock and the smoke detector. I thought of the jar. I thought of Quinn and the sapling by the bridge. The house was full of small truths, and the law was finally at the doorstep. I ushered him in. The living room smelled of lavender-scented wipes Bryn kept for visitors. The detective's eyes scanned the room, polite and investigative. He asked for our names and basic statements, and I said what I had to, what any man does when the law steps into your living room. You tell the truth, you hold what you can, and you wait for the process to turn like a slow gear. When he left, the house seemed a little emptier because an external order had stepped into our chaos and sanctioned us with legitimacy. I sat in Kellen's office and looked at the screen. The footage looped silently, a small thing repeating. I thought about the bridge and its sagging middle, about how a structure can bend without breaking, but only if someone takes the time to shore up the failing beams. We were close. We had a key hidden inside a child's memory, footage, and a lawyer willing to move. But we also had enemies who had learned how to move the ledger without being noticed. Bryn had the advantage of the grief that had been shaping choices around her like a fog. The house at night held a different kind of sound, the creak of old wood, the tick of an unseen clock, and the tiny rustle that comes from secrets being turned over. I slept in the basement that night, on the cot Bryn had left, feeling the house as an inspector feels a bridge. Every vibration tells you where the load is greatest. Before sleep took me, I thought of Kellen's last engineering problem. Some small structural defect he had joked about in the months before his death. He had meant it as a metaphor. I had not wanted it to be prophetic. Now his designs were more than metaphors. They were a roadmap for surviving someone else's plan. When morning came, I made coffee and sat with the list. The DA had agreed to file for a warrant to access the cloud, but they needed a demonstration that the files were relevant and that removing them might risk destruction. Kellen's cameras provided that link, but the cloud was the hinge. We had the footage, but until we could show a prosecutor the cloud ledgers and the offshore transfers, we could not be sure. Garrett said quietly, "We push for a warrant this afternoon. We go by the book. We bring them everything and hope the law moves. We push for a warrant this afternoon. We go by the book. We bring them everything and hope the law moves." The DA moved faster than I expected. Jonathan called with the kind of voice lawyers keep for good news, measured, relieved. "They want to see the footage before they file," he said. "But they've read your packet. They're drafting a warrant for the cloud and for a sample from the jar. You did right to bag it. Keep everything exactly where it is until they arrive." There is a strange comfort in official words. A warrant is a hinge. It turns the private into public, and in that turning, the hidden becomes accountable. Garrett and I sat in the living room with the laptop open, the footage queued, like men waiting to test a bridge after repair. Quinn did her homework at the kitchen table. Bryn hovered in the doorway with the cool face of someone who has rehearsed grief as though it were a script that needed perfect delivery. Milo paced outside and came in only when invited, the sort of presence that smells of diesel and impatience. The detective who had come earlier, Detective Rivera, arrived with 2 partners and a warrant tucked into a plain folder. They moved with an economy familiar to men who had seen domestic scenes decayed by cunning. Rivera was patient but direct. "We have authority to pull records from the cloud and to search the house for any additional storage devices," he said. "We also have the authority to seize financial documentation related to the accounts you told us about." Garrett handed over copies. Jonathan explained the chain as if he were describing load calculations to a skeptical contractor. Itemize, photograph, log, and let the law do its work. They took the jar, the USB copies, the SD cards, the laptop with duplicates, and a list of suspected account numbers. They asked me to recount what Quinn had told me. I did, measured, and plain. Quinn answered when the woman detective leaned down and asked in a voice softer than a caution sign, "Can you tell me what you told your granddad?" Quinn did. She said what she'd said before, that Bryn had given Daddy something blue, that she had tasted it once on a spoon, that Bryn had told her it would help with the shakes. The detective nodded and wrote in block letters the way a bridge engineer labels steel. "Good," she said. "You're very brave." There's a kind of adult cruelty that exists when children are asked to be brave. I hated that we had to call on her courage, but she delivered her truth like a small, necessary beam. By afternoon, the cloud warrant had arrived. The county prosecutor's office had routed it through their tech division. There was a small, efficient team on the other end of the line receiving the transmission as Garrett and I streamed a proof-of-life file to show the chain, timestamps from the camera, the burned SD cards, and the USB copy named For Dad, TXT. The tech analyst asked for the code, and Quinn, the key holder, hovered close enough to see the screen. She said the numbers soft and certain, 051505, 051505. It felt like watching a small ritual. Accessing the cloud felt anticlimactic and revelatory at once. Files poured into the prosecutor's server. Kitchen, Cam, 2019, 07-12, MP4, Smoke Hallway, 2020-02-03.MP4. Messages, metadata, and a transcript of a phone call that mentioned transfers. There were emails tied to an offshore account that matched lines Jonathan had flagged, and metadata that showed files accessed and then deleted days after Kellen's death. The timestamp patterns were the kind of thing a detector like Garrett notices: repetition, coincidence, and then obvious choreography. When we pulled the living room footage onto the big TV, it looked innocuous. Television light, slippers kicked off, Kellen's habit of reading maps, even as the play-by-play grew like smoke from an engine. There were clips where Bryn titrated hospitality into explanation, giving a little sip here, this will help there, each action anonymous until you watched them together. A second camera angle, clipped from a cell phone, captured Bryn on a call saying, "He's slowing down the way we expected. Keep the transfers coming." Milo appeared in the background more than once, unloading boxes, his hands crossing financial papers over to an indistinct figure. Garrett and I watched the footage in a way that felt both disgraceful and necessary. The images were not pretty. There is no clean selling of what betrayal feels like when it is domestic and patient. But they were evidence. They were a ledger in motion. We did not have to do much to move the law then. The detectives took the footage, secured it to their servers, and called in the uniformed officers. "That's more than probable," Rivera said. "That's probable plus. We will place Bryn and Milo into custody pending further interviews." Bryn's denial was precise as a ledger entry. "This is invasion," she told the detective, her voice an inventory of controlled outrage. "You're violating my rights." "Your rights are intact," the officer said. "But if there's evidence you committed a crime, you'll have the opportunity to address it at the appropriate time." There was a moment like the click of a latch. Bryn's face twitched. Milo made a small, futile movement toward the back door where he thought the truck could be a vector. A uniformed officer blocked the path with the quiet efficiency of someone delivering a load-bearing post. The arrest unfolded cleanly. Handcuffs, statements read, an officer on scene to stand with Quinn out of harmful sight. Bryn's phone lit up like a funeral lantern. She was taken to the cruiser with a look that suggested outrage and surprise in equal measure. Milo's mouth worked, as if to form sentences that would later be polished into confessions or pleas. They were processed, their mugs recorded, their statements held against the recordings we had. The immediate legal action was not the end. Arrest means suspension, not conviction. It meant the county detectives would open a file and the DA would prepare indictments. But at that moment, with the cuffs clicking, something shifted. I felt the house tilt away from theft and toward accountability. The forensic lab wanted fresh samples, the jar, the residue, and Kellen's tissue. These were different vaults of truth. The DA's office sought a court order for an exhumation. That day I sat with Garrett and Jonathan in a room that smelled like old coffee and new seriousness, and signed the orders that would bring the dead into evidence. There is an intimacy to asking the earth to yield back what you'd placed in it. Exhumation feels like reopening a ledger that the family had once closed. The county made the motion, and Judge Myra Thorne, a woman rumored to have the patience of a river and the clarity of a compass, signed. "We move with respect," she wrote in the order. "We will allow the path of law to determine truth." Forensic report. The state forensics lab confirmed that post-mortem tissue samples from Kellen's autopsy contained measurable concentrations consistent with ethylene glycol. Toxicology language is careful. Concentrations suggested a pattern of ingestion over time rather than a single accidental exposure. Findings were corroborated with the residue sampled from the jar seized in the house. A blood sample taken from me at the hospital earlier in the investigation returned traces consistent with exposure to the same compound, supporting a theory that both Kellen and I were intentionally administered the substance. The lab's conclusions were phrased as scientific probabilities and not law. The DA used that language to connect the dots. "I will not detail the chemistry. There is no purpose to instruct." The lab's confirmation gave the prosecutor the bridge she needed. Evidence showed that the cause of death was not natural diabetic decline, but a pattern of toxic exposure consistent with intentional administration. That turned suspicion into indictment. The grand jury convened. Prosecutors presented the chain, The forged POA, the videos from the smoke detector and clock and phone, the financial transfers to an offshore account tied to Doris Hargrove, the AR message where transfers were discussed, and the forensic finding. The grand jury returned indictments for counts that included murder and fraud. Bryn faced the weightiest charge. Milo faced charges as an accomplice. The whistle of the court system can be slow, but when it catches, it pulls hard. At arraignment, Bryn pleaded not guilty. The courtroom was a place of neutral architecture, oak benches polished by years of sitting, and it felt to me like a bridge built without ornament. Prosecutors filed motions to admit the surveillance footage, the SD cards, the cloud logs, and the financial records. The defense filed motions of their own, insisting on chain of custody scrutiny and challenging the context of the footage. Our counsel, Jonathan, stood with me in a posture that felt more like kin than counsel. He looked at me once and said, "Silas, we will be ready." Trial preparations consumed months. There were legal wrangles about admissibility, about hearsay, about the propriety of a child's testimony. The defense suggested Quinn's recollection was coached. They implied grief could be performed. The prosecutor objected with the kind of quiet force that leaves room for facts to do the pushing. Garrett and I spent long afternoons preparing, reviewing clips with the DA's team, labeling exhibits, double and triple checking logs. There was a sameness to the routine. It felt less like drama and more like engineering, attention to tolerance, certification and redundancy. When the trial opened, Judge Thorne's courtroom looked smaller than I had imagined. Bryn sat at the defense table with her hands folded. Milo's head dipped and lifted like a pendulum. Doris Hargrove's name was there in clean legal print, on a separate set of documents that indicated federal interest. International transfers that triggered an investigation by the Financial Crimes Unit. If the trial meant a local reckoning, the offshore account meant federal teeth. Opening statements came like measured beams. The prosecutor described betrayal. "This is a case about trust engineered into a home and then ripped out," she said. She played snippets of the footage for the jury, the same clips that had made my stomach thin with grief, sufficient to show pattern without appealing to the jury's darker impulses. The defense painted a different portrait. A bereaved woman under suspicion, a man who died of underlying illness. They said the footage showed moments of caregiving, not harm. I kept my face blank and my heart a ledger. In the gallery, Quinn sat with a social worker and a children's counselor who had come at the DA's request. We had arranged for her testimony to minimize trauma. She would not be cross-examined in front of the jury the way adults are. Instead, the court allowed a recorded, carefully mediated statement. The judge permitted her statement to be played through closed circuit, so she would not have to endure the glare of a courtroom witness stand. It was a decision I remember as both mercy and justice. When Quinn's recording played, the room turned small. She described in her 9-year-old cadence the spoon, the blue syrup, and the time she was told not to tell. The jurors listened, and I felt the weight of every step Kellen and I had taken become visible. Children are, in law as in life, unlikely reservoirs of truth. The prosecutor treated Quinn's account with tenderness and firmness, prefacing the playback with a request that the jury consider the totality of the evidence. Other pieces fell into place in court, like the final rivets of a girder. The bank record showed wire transfers to accounts controlled by a shell company that, according to a federal affidavit, funneled money to a trust in Doris Hargrove's name. The prosecution called a forensic accountant who stood at the lectern and explained in plain language the movement of funds and the timing. "You see," she said, "transfers begun the same week Bryn's POA was filed. There are patterns, small transfers initially, then larger ones after Kellen's hospitalization." The defense tried to cast doubt on motive and method. They called character witnesses who described Kellen's medical condition and presented a doctor who testified about the natural progression of certain organic failures. The prosecutor dismantled that testimony with the lab's toxicology report. The report was careful, professional, and devastating in its implication. Ethylene glycol was present at concentrations consistent with purposeful ingestion and corroborated by residue in the jar. There were moments in trial where my hands looked like blueprints, folding and refolding in my lap. The prosecutor called Garrett to testify about the camera discovery and chain of custody, and then called Detective Rivera to lay out the arrests. Jonathan sat near me, and once he whispered, "You did right by him, by Kellen." When the defense tried to suggest that Bryn had been a caring partner who sought to manage an overwhelmed household, the prosecutor replied with the ledger of acts, the forged POA, the destruction of heirlooms, the timing of transfers, the discreet disposal of papers, and the footage that showed confirmation of intent. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In the final hours of deliberation, I thought of bridges and how often a single compromised connection can undermine the whole. I also thought about the stubbornness of repair. The verdict was guilty on the counts of murder and fraud. Bryn's face folded in a way I had not seen. Not shock, but a small, organized collapse. Milo, who had taken a plea before trial for his part, testified as part of a deal. He admitted to carrying boxes, to receiving instructions, to moving paperwork, and to meeting with an account manager in Florida. His plea spared him from the harshest sentence but placed him firmly as an accomplice in the scheme. He received a sentence that kept him confined for years. Doris Hargrove's holdings were frozen by federal agents, and through coordinated action with the Justice Department, a significant portion of the assets tied to the transfers were seized. The money was eventually repatriated to the estate. Judge Myra Thorne handed down sentences with an evenness that both settled and echoed. Bryn received a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction and additional years for the fraud counts. The courtroom's sound dampened like a cable taut under load. The sentence felt to me like a legal measure of the weight that had been taken off the house. After conviction, there was the more bureaucratic and tender business of repair. The court appointed me temporary guardian of Quinn while formal guardianship proceedings were settled. Jonathan worked the paperwork into a legally binding trust that prioritized Quinn's education and care, and the seized assets from Doris's connections were eventually applied to the estate to compensate and to fund Quinn's future. The process was slow and deliberate. Probate is no place for rapid gestures, but each signature felt like a replacement beam hammered into place. We exhumed Kellen, and the lab confirmed to the DA's satisfaction what we'd first suspected. The forensic pathologist testified in court with the calm of a man who speaks in measurements. The concentrations and the context align with exogenous administration of a toxic compound consistent with ethylene glycol, he stated. He did not embellish. He did not offer melodrama. He said, in the clinical way of experts, that the evidence supported the conclusion the prosecution had argued. During sentencing, when the judge spoke about betrayal, she spoke about the architecture of trust. Homes are meant to be safe shelters, she said. When trust, like a main cable, is cut intentionally, the law must respond to hold the structure. Her words hung in the courtroom like rivets. Outside the courthouse, I felt both hollow and relieved. The criminal justice system had performed its duty, but the house, my house, still carried fractures that took time to mend. There were repairs to be made that had nothing to do with beams and everything to do with routines. The placing back of photographs, the rehanging of portraits, the reteaching of a child that not all adults will take advantage of their trust. One afternoon, while the world was still moving and the legal forms were still a stack on Jonathan's desk, I found a small cardboard box tucked into Kellen's old workshop bench. Inside was a prototype, an elegant little device he'd been tinkering with, Something to do with structural monitoring and low-weight sensors he'd been piecing together in late nights. It was crude, ready to be improved, but to me it was a map of possibility. Patent sketches, a letter to me, and a seed investment Kellen had set aside in a trust for Quinn's education, all spelled out in his precise hand. His letter read, in part, "If you're reading this, Dad, then I'm either being dramatic or you've been busy as ever. Use the funds for Quinn if you must. Don't let anyone tell her engineering isn't a language for the heart. Love, Kay." There was a small leather ring inside, too. A simple band Kellen had given me at some point, a gesture between men who have always been more than father and son. Partners who knew the value of redundancy. On the inner face, Kellen had scratched 3 initials and a date. I stood at the workbench and held the ring to light. Its weight was small, but it reminded me, legacy is not always money. Sometimes it's a set of instructions and the stubbornness to act on them. We repaired what we could. I reclaimed the rooms upstairs, not by triumph but by necessity. The house had been used against us. Now we used it for healing. The shattered china was replaced with the pieces Margaret had kept for years. She brought over a few of hers as a dowry for memory. The photographs, some recovered from boxes stored in garages, were reframed. We had to explain to Quinn what had happened in doses that matched her age. An honest curriculum of safety and boundaries, of how to trust and whom to tell when trust is in danger. There were still small things to do: clear the names on titles, move a few accounts into trust, change locks, update probate. There was also the quiet work of learning to laugh in rooms that had held grief. My hands learned the contours of the banister again. I learned to sleep without a radio tuned to remember. The network of friends and neighbors, Margaret, Garrett, Jonathan, became a scaffold that allowed us to begin to climb back into weather. We planted the cherry tree by the bridge the following spring. Quinn held the spade with earnestness, and I guided her hand. We placed the sapling where the breeze would speak to it, and where, one day, it might shade a place for study. Kellen had loved bridges, the simplicity of tension and counter-tension, the way each cable trusts the others to carry the load. We wanted the tree to be visible from the bridge, a living ledger of what had been gained and what had been lost. A small part of the estate was locked into a trust that would fund Quinn's education and guardianship needs. Jonathan helped set up a conservatorship with a trustee who had no connection to family life, to ensure that no future Bryn could manipulate a child's future for gain. That was part of the restoration work, making the future inhospitable to the manipulations that had once worked. There were difficult moments. At the funeral of justice, as I put it to myself, I walked alone toward Kellen's grave. I did not expect solace. I expected a sentence to end and a longer work to begin. I placed my hand on the cold stone and spoke in a voice that was mostly for me. "You built redundancies," I said. "You thought ahead. I'm trying to follow the blueprints. I do not pretend there was closure like a snap. Grief is a long process of shoring and replacing. There were seasons where the house hummed with silence like a bridge with rusted bolts. There were nights when Quinn would wake and we would hold a small vigil, reading aloud stories Kellen used to love. We told them simple things about repair and load and caring. We taught her how to document, to keep copies, to give keys to trusted people, to always speak up. I received after the trial a small envelope from Jonathan with court documents and a letter from the DA. The DA's closing note was brief. "The system worked because you brought the evidence. The cameras, the backups, the willfulness to pursue the truth carried this." I kept the letter in my desk like proof of something both fragile and firm. There were small private moments of faith. I said once to a friend, "I believe God watches over the broken places." It was not a doctrinal statement so much as a small personal comfort, a little architecture of consolation. I kept it private, a rivet that held me when night came heavy. Time allowed the house to be repaired physically. A new banister, a repaint, the returning of the box of letters that had been found in a pawned trunk. We put a lock on the grandfather clock, a modest irony, but left the niche where Kellen had put the USB as a reminder that vigilance pays. We installed, at Quinn's insistence, a new camera at a height she could not reach. Only now it was there to watch over homework, not to watch for malice. One bright afternoon, after the court decision's final and the trust established, I took Quinn to the suspension bridge. The cables sang in the wind. The span shone. The bridge is honest in ways houses are not. It does not pretend to be warm. It is functional, meant to carry loads from one side to another. I pointed out the tension rods, the way each one responds to weight and weather. You can't make a bridge without trusting that the other pieces will hold with you, I said. She looked at me with a grandmother's wisdom in a child's face. Are we fixed now? She asked, with that child's directness. We are building, I said, and building asks patience. But yes, we are fixed where it matters. We're fixing tomorrow. We walked across, and at the center she stopped and looked down at the water. I thought of Kellen then, his jokes, his ways of making the ordinary bearable. I took from my pocket the small leather ring he had left and slipped it on my finger. I'd always associated it with him, and now it felt like a band that closed when you commit to hold weight, not with vengeance, but with duty. I do not say the state of peace is perfect. It never is. A bridge still succumbs to rust if unmaintained. People still make choices that hurt others. But we had re-established load-bearing for the family. Quinn has a future that, while shaded by loss, is protected legally and practically. There are guardians to call, money in a trust to fund her studies, a home that is hers again. Some people asked why I didn't seek revenge when the law took its course. The answer is simple. I spent my life measuring loads to create safe crossings, not to break them. There is little nobility in breaking systems. There is repair in making them right. In the months that followed, we opened Kellen's workshop to a small scholarship fund in his name. We donated a portion of the repatriated estate to a foundation that supports elder care protections and legal counseling for families. It was small reparation, a practical grain of restoration. Quinn grew into being someone who carries caution like a tool in a belt, rather than as armor. She learned to ask questions when things didn't add up. She learned to tell. Sometimes at night I still wake and hear the echo of argument and the soft clink of cups. But that is passing. There is also the sound of a tree growing, small leaves rubbing together in wind. I have learned to hold those sounds both, because life is not a straight beam of joy or pain. It is a composite, layered and savvy to survive. On a quiet Sunday, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched Quinn herd a bunch of neighborhood kids under the new cherry tree. They played at engineers, building bridges with sticks and imagination. Margaret brought over cookies and sat with me. She didn't say much. She never did. She settled into the way of neighbors who know how to be constant without being intrusive. At the end of most days, I take a small turn across the bridge alone. I watch the cables and think of Kellen's little redundancies and of the work we had to do to return the house to being ours. I like to think of legacy not as something you possess, but as something you leave in the circulation of living, less a monument and more a set of instructions. If there's a moral to tell, it is this. Pay attention to the seams, keep copies of what matters, name the people you trust, teach the young to question when something tastes wrong, keep your records, build redundancies, and when wrong is done, trust that the law, if given good evidence and patience, can be a tool of restoration. Before I let you go, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you were in my shoes, what would you do first? Share your thoughts. I read them. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity can be guarded and that sometimes the right kind of patience and proof will move the world back toward justice. Subscribe now to Peter's Stories YT and join a community that values powerful stories, deep emotions, and life lessons that truly matter.